that the state of the culture is the resume of the church. There's a big difference between Jesus saying, "My kingdom is not of this world," and him saying, "My kingdom is not in this world." Being the kind of people that are a physical antithesis to the lies. In a world of lies, you want to tell the truth. In a world of escapism, fatalism, and despondency, you want to be the kind of person that lives with a sense of hope and joy.
Hi friends, welcome back to Ideas Have Consequences, the podcast of the Disciple Nations Alliance. My name is Luke Allen. I'm the producer of the show, and I am joined by our host and my dad, Scott Allen. Hey Dad, how you doing today?
Hey Luke, doing great.
Yeah, this is great. I'm excited for today's interview. We have a good friend coming on the show for his third time now, but before we introduce him, I just want to introduce this show. As you guys know, the mission of this show is to examine how our mission as Christians is to not only spread the gospel around the world to all the nations, but it is also to be the hands and feet of God to transform the nations, to increasingly reflect God's truth, goodness, and beauty. Tragically, the church has largely neglected this second part of her mission, and today most Christians have little influence on their surrounding cultures. Join us on this podcast as we rediscover what it means for each of us to disciple our nations and to create Christ-honoring cultures that reflect the character of the living God and the kingdom of God, I may add. Today's discussion was a lot of fun. Just as far as highlights go, Dad, today we talked with Lennox Kalifungwa. I guess we can just share who our guest is today. Good friend of ours, joining us from over in Moscow, Idaho, formerly from Zambia, I believe, he might have been born in South Africa, but
he's from Africa.
A Southern African until quite recently, and now he's over here in the U.S. Today we talked with him about a variety of issues, one of which was a recent CNN interview that he got to be a part of, him, Doug Wilson, and then some other people from his church, an interview that went viral. So we wanted to talk to him about that, get his reactions to that. We also hit on a lot of other things. Dad, just coming away from this discussion, just if you could give people a little idea of what to expect in today's episode, what were some of your highlights?
I thought for me it was just a great opportunity. The ministry up in Moscow, Idaho, with Doug Wilson, the New College of New St. Andrews, and the other aspects of that ministry have generated a lot of attention, both in evangelical circles, but also in the popular press. As indicated by that CNN interview, that was really our kind of jump off point into the conversation, and so. It's a ministry that generates a lot of a concern. People, it's kind of a lightning rod, and so it gave us. I thought today was great because Lennox is a friend. We knew him before he was working up there in Moscow, so it gave us a chance to kind of push in and ask some questions about what's really going on. What is their approach to reaching out in a city like Moscow and beyond into the nation? What about the kind of stereotypes that some evangelicals have of the work that are negative or critical? So I thought that was really great opportunity to just ask some questions and try to understand a little bit more of what's happening there. So,
yeah, absolutely. A lot of people have kind of preconceived notions about what's going on up there in North Idaho, including CNN. And I think it's best whenever you have thoughts like that about someone or a group is just go talk to them.
So yeah, we just invite you to listen to Lennox today and think carefully about what he's saying. Do you agree or do you disagree? We'll let you decide that. So
without further ado, Dad, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest today?
Lennox, it's great to have you. We're here today with Lennox Kalifungwa, who's been on our podcast twice at least, maybe more than that. So it's great to have you back, Lennox.
It's so good to be back. You're some of my favorite people to converse with, and it's been just incredible to have experienced this beautiful friendship that we've built up over the last couple of years, and it's just been so rich. So thank you. This is such an honor for me.
Well, those are very kind words. We completely concur on our side, Lennox. So for those of you who are new to the podcast, haven't been introduced to Lennox, let me just give a brief introduction. Lennox, you can fill in as well anything that you'd like to say. Lennox is a native of Zambia. He is a Christian thinker, public speaker, writer, and a journalist who seeks to apply biblical theology to the whole of life. His work has appeared in Forbes, Republic Sentinel, The American Thinker, and other publications. We're also privileged to consider Lennox a close friend and associate of the Disciple Nations Alliance, mostly from his time in Africa, although today Lennox and his family and is it 2 children, Lennox?
3.
2 young children? 3 children, yeah, sorry about that. 3 young children live in Moscow, Idaho, which is a long ways away from Zambia. And Lennox is currently associated with New St. Andrews College and the various ministries of Doug Wilson. Luke and I had a really just great privilege of being up there earlier this year, having a chance to visit with Lennox, be on the podcast there. What's the name of your podcast again, Lennox? I should know that off the top of my head.
Oh, that's fine. It's called Of Flames and Crowns.
Flames and Crowns, yeah. So it was just such an honor to be up there with you, Lennox. Lennox, tell us, again, remind me, I guess, what is your, do you have an official title, or what's your official capacity there?
Sure, yeah. In many ways, I like to think of myself as New St. Andrews College's mascot, so I just kind of need to get the full outfit for it now. But my official title is Digital Engagement Officer, which is really a focus on communications. So I write for the college, I create content for the college, essentially just trying to amplify its image and its voice in the broader culture, and specifically amplifying its voice in present cultural conversations that are happening as well. And that's what prompted the start of the podcast. In fact, there's a second podcast that I've got as well called Kings and Statesmen, which focuses on politics very specifically. So I certainly have my hands full trying to do all those things.
No kidding. Wow. Well, yeah, we wanted to have you on today just to pick up on that very theme there that you're mentioning in terms of your role. And I do want to encourage our listeners, if you're not familiar with the College of New St. Andrews, I really want you to check that out, especially if you have high school-aged children and you're starting to think about college. This is really one that you do need to take into consideration. They're doing just really great work up there. What I appreciate so much about New St. Andrews is how distinctively and deliberately they're building their curriculum around a biblical worldview. A lot of Christian universities talk about that, but very often it's quite syncretized. When you get into the curriculum, you see how syncretized it is with, dominant cultural assumptions, especially woke ones and things like that. But boy, New St. Andrews, you could not charge them with that at all. They're really rooted in the scriptures, and it's and excellence, a spirit of excellence up there too. So, anyways, yeah, we wanted to have you on, Lennox, because New St. Andrews, Doug Wilson, has been in the news. Often it is, but in a significant way because of a recent segment that CNN had with you and with Doug Wilson and other people associated with the ministry up there, and that just aired, I think it was about 2 weeks ago. And I believe it was prompted, if I'm not, you could correct me, but I believe it was prompted by the fact that our Pete Hegseth, the director of defense, the head of the Pentagon, the director of defense, is attending one of Doug Wilson's branch churches, right, in Washington, D.C. Is that correct, Lennox?
Yes, that's correct. So I believe that when Hegseth is in D.C., that's the church he attends. But when he, I think, is back in Tennessee, he also attends a CREC church, which is a denomination that Doug Wilson started as well. So I suppose all that affiliation is pretty significant in many people's minds. But certainly that's what's sparked it, and specifically the fact that there's this new church plant in DC, which has attracted significant names.
Wow, that's exciting! I was really happy to hear that. I thought that was very encouraging to me to know that you have, first of all, a church in Washington D.C. And that it is it has people like Pete Hegseth attending. I think that's wonderful. Lennox, you had a part to play in that interview. It was neat to see you on CNN. I was kind of like, wow, I know that guy.
Right.
And you said in the interview, it was brief. Your clip, all the clips were brief. You said that you moved from Africa to Moscow to, quote, build Christian institutions. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that vision that prompted you to to pick up and make that kind of dramatic move, and what your experience has been like so far?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's interesting because, when I mentioned this in the interview, what was edited in a final cut was about 15 seconds long, right? So it really was like a glorified cameo, if I can put it that way. But my entire conversation with them was about 40 to 45 minutes long. So I find it interesting that that's the one portion that they clipped. But I think it did still underscore a very big reason for what I'm doing now, which is, living in Moscow, involved with New St. Andrews College, really to build Christian institutions. And I believe that one of the ways that we shape culture effectively, one of the ways that we propagate a distinctly Christian culture, is by building institutions, and not just randomly building them, but actually building them with a fundamental ethos that is God glorifying, that is people focused as well, and that has a tangible connection to the community that is being served. And I suppose when I looked at New St. Andrews College, and when I looked at the Moscow project as a whole, I thought that these were people who were really doing that well. And I wanted to be a part of efforts that do that. I suppose the Lord has given me a pioneering mind, so to speak. I like to see things get off the ground. I like to see things grow, and I like to help institutions grow specifically. And the opportunity to be a part of these efforts was one I wanted to jump at, and it's been such a rich experience so far. It's interesting because in many ways the Christian community in Moscow does get a lot of the headlines. We've had various publications do stories on us over time. Just in the recent past, I think we've had Politico do something on us. Of course, CNN do something on us. I believe something with the Associated Press is also on its way. So we're constantly in the news. But what impresses me most about Moscow is not so much what you see in the headlines per se, but it's just the fact that you have ordinary people whose names people might not know, who are just being faithful and building things. So it's not just the big names who are building things. It's all kinds of people. There's a culture of building here. There's a culture of life-giving. And I think that's what enables this town to be what it is, where you have this very significant Christian presence in a town that's actually largely liberal. So Idaho is very much a conservative state by and large, and yet it does have these blue dots, and I think Moscow being one of them, specifically because we're right on the Washington border, but also because we have Washington State University just 15 minutes away, and we have the University of Idaho in town as well. And I think that's actually the ground that enables us to do our work so effectively. We want to engage with people in this way. And it's just amazing to see people who are sold out on this. And when I talk about building institutions, yes, it does involve building businesses and institutions that have that kind of direct cultural impact. But it's also people being serious about building households and faithful ones, being faithful in their marriages and raising their children in the fear of the Lord, being very intentional also about being part of the church and in covenant fellowship with like-minded people. And I think that's actually the strength of this community. It's not so much in the flare and the lights, it's in, I think, the substance that enables us to be faithful day in, day out, week in, week out. And that's been a rich experience, and I think that's what it really takes to build and shape culture in a very effective way. And so, yeah, it's been an amazing time here. We've been here just over a year, and I think the Lord has really blessed us in many ways. It's been very fruitful, and I just count it a privilege that I get to add or contribute something to such an excellent community already.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying about building institutions. And there in Moscow specifically, you mentioned, just your own families. I mean, that's an institution. You mentioned the churches, of course, and then you've got the university there, and then there's businesses as well. So I know that have come up from the graduates of New St. Andrews, some really prominent businesses that are having ripple effects around the nation and beyond. So I think evangelicals, because of, particular bents in theology, I remember reading how, in earlier generations, evangelicals were quite good at building institutions, mission agencies, churches, schools, universities. But, over the last 100 years, with this kind of theology of escape, and, the world's coming to an end, and it's, everything is dark, and, we stopped doing that largely, or we kind of narrowed down the scope of those schools that we were building to just teaching things like the Bible, and don't bother with things like mathematics or science or economics, those kind of more cultural, worldly things. They don't really matter. They're coming to an end, So I appreciate so much the spirit there in Moscow at New St. Andrews that kind of rejects that idea that we need to be salt and light and build institutions that are blessing and honor Christ in our culture. So I want to come back, though, Lennox, if I could, just to, you mentioned how you are in the news, not just CNN, you mentioned Politico and some other prominent news outlets. Tell me a little bit about how folks up there, yourself included, think about engaging with the media, particularly a hostile media. I mean, I would call CNN a hostile media in the sense that, and you could see that in the interview, right? They clearly aren't coming from your same basic set of presuppositions and worldview. And what, is that something, those kinds of interviews with hostile media, is that something that you feel like you should, I mean, obviously you are engaging in, so I assume you feel like you should engage in them, and if so, why?
That's an excellent question. I think on one hand, we don't naturally go out of our way looking for those kinds of things. And when they do happen, I think there's a sense in which we're encouraged by it, because it means that we are being effective in at least being a compelling voice in the cultural conversation. And so that's a good tell. When certain quarters get concerned about certain things, you're doing something. You know that there's that you are leading a conversation or a prominent voice in a conversation, and that's certainly encouraging. And I think for that reason, we have been very willing to engage and use that as an opportunity to share the truth. And what's interesting is, and this is just some background of the CNN interview, one of the things that the journalist who was interviewing us, her name is Pamela Brown, and I should give a caveat that, in the actual conversation, she was very cordial. And even off camera, I thought that she asked some very good questions. Her and her producer came across as very sincere people. Of course, the final edit might have been framed a certain way, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it was a good opportunity. And I think not just an opportunity to air our thoughts to millions of people, but also just an opportunity to engage with individuals like her. Right, and seeing that as a really good opportunity. This isn't just some machine. This actually involves people. No man has ever met a mere mortal. And so we care about being able to engage with everyone, every single individual we possibly can. And we see this as an opportunity, really, certainly, to propagate ideas of truth, beauty, and goodness. And just being ourselves. I do think that the Lord has blessed Moscow in many ways. And there's a sense in which we'd like to share this blessing with other people and help people understand what it means to be a Christian, help people understand the implications of the gospel as well and what that looks like in practice. And that being the sort of light that makes people think and wonder, oh wow, how can I experience that kind of freedom? How can I experience that kind of human flourishing? And pointing them back to the cross. And I think that's really the goal in all this as well, is we want to see people reconciled to God through Jesus Christ and living their lives under his lordship. That's the goal. And so even with hostile media, there's actually a sense in which I think hostile media tends to have more of a viral effect in the way it's going to do things. I mean, this CNN piece, it's just incredible, just the many millions that have actually seen this and the kinds of conversations that it's prompted. And I think it's just a good, I'd say, strategic way of continuing, I think, what is a necessary conversation about truth and about culture. And we're grateful for those opportunities to do those kinds of things.
Let me, I guess I guess I've got questions myself about this, because after I watched the clip, I don't know how long it was, I think it was like 5 minutes, In other words, you guys, I think you said you gave about a 40-minute interview with the journalist. Other people gave lengthy interviews, many, many minutes of interviews. And yet what you saw in the final cut, which, was dramatically cut and edited, I would say that the thrust of that segment was, here are some very frightening Christians up here in Moscow, Idaho, Christian nationalists that are trying to take over the country. And we need to be very cautious and worried about groups that are, somewhat dangerous groups. That's my takeaway from kind of what they were trying to portray, and in that clip. And I'm sure you guys walked in with eyes wide open and figured, yeah, that's probably what's going to come out. Did you have any agreement with them on the editing of that, or did you just say, hey, whatever you do with these segments, these 40-minute interview clips, is fine with us? Or I was kind of curious.
Yeah, and just real quick before that, just so people know that the title of this piece we're talking about, it's about 7 minutes, is called He Thinks, referring to Doug Wilson, he thinks America should adopt a Christian theocracy, and he's finding a new audience under Trump. So strong words. It's just they're trying to paint a picture in all of that. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lennox.
Sure. Yeah, they really are. So we didn't have any kind of agreement with them on this. I mean, they're CNN, they can do their little bit. I think we did have a requirement for us to record something on our end, just to make sure that there's transparency should things not be represented accurately. And so we fully expected that CNN would edit this in an interesting way, probably cut out a lot of things. That was to be expected. I think by and large, even though we kind of laugh at the way some of the things were cut, I think by and large, it still turned out pretty good. Like, I think we're generally quite happy with how it turned out. I think even in the attempts to portray us a certain way, and sort of provoke, push the needle there and get some people triggered on what's happening here, I'd like to believe that the truth still won in all of it, and I think it prompted some good thought and some good conversation. There were many comments where people, would respond and say, wow, well, if that's what's going on, that actually sounds like a pretty good idea. And so I think what they might have meant for evil, I think in many ways God has actually used for good. Now, of course, I don't think pieces are always going to turn out like this per se. I think the one thing that they did a fairly decent job on was they did allow us to provide a little bit of context for what people would consider controversial convictions. And that certainly was helpful. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it turned out great. With hostile media, you never know how it's really going to turn out. But all you can really do is tell the truth, be as mindful as possible of what you're saying and how you're saying it, and pray that sticks. And it was interesting to see how this turned out, but overall I think it was pretty good.
I'm glad you feel that way. I wrestled with it after I watched it, because in my mind I was thinking of the primary audience that was going to be watching it, the primary audience of CNN. They're not evangelical Christians largely. They're probably leaning left, progressives. And the stereotype that they have of people like yourself and Luke and I, is these are dangerous people. They are trying to, the Handmaid's Tale, right? They're trying to take us back to some very dark place. And we need, and they literally believe that. I mean, that's the literal way that they see us, that they've been so shaped by a false narrative, right? But that's what they believe. And I don't know, my concern is that we, is it wise, I guess, I'll just say it, is it wise to allow them to kind of further that false narrative, willingly. Sure. But you're right. I mean, God knows what He's going to do with this, and but those were some of my thoughts after I watched it. Mm-hmm.
And I think those thoughts are quite understandable as well. And you're right. I think a big part of it is just leaving it in the Lord's hands, right. Speaking the truth and praying that it carries forward, right. And that God uses it in fruitful ways. I think the other side of it, though, and I mean, this might come off as very controversial, but I think that in a world that has built a glass house of lies, one of the most loving things you can do is shatter that glass house with the truth. And that's not to say you want to be provocative as an end in itself, but I think it's about speaking the truth, which is just provocative on its own to people who love lies. Is sometimes they kind of need to be shocked out of their lies and be prompted to think in different categories than they may be used to thinking. And sometimes things like that provide an opportunity for those kinds of things. Sometimes I think what needs to happen is a willingness for people to disrupt cultural idols, and not be polite to the idolatry. Of course, we want to love the people, but we want to absolutely see their idolatry ended. And sometimes the best way to do it is to utilize opportunities like this. And so sure, that this would largely be an audience that doesn't have the best thoughts of what Christianity is. They think we're weirdos who are trying to ruin the world, so to speak. And there's a sense in which maybe that's just going to be inescapable. I think Scripture, I forget which passage specifically, this might be in Corinthians if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Thessalonians, but the idea of the wisdom of God looking like foolishness to the world. And there's
funny.
a sense in
I'm
which...
looking at that right now, Lennox. 1 Corinthians 2:14.
Oh, there we go. Yes. And I think that actually is a very real thing that Christians just need to embrace. What we believe as the truth is not necessarily going to be celebrated or liked by a non-believing world. They're not going to like us. They're going to think that what we believe is foolish. And I think in accepting that also frees us from the temptation to appease them, which I think is an ineffective strategy in the long term. And I think Christians have tried this, and I don't think it's actually worked very effectively, where we thought that, well, if we just learn to be like them and throw in Jesus there, then we can win them that way. And I don't think that's been a very effective strategy. In fact, if anything, I think it prompts a syncretism where you can still have degenerate expressions of culture alongside your Jesus and Christianity. And I think that's a dangerous thing. And so I think that it's healthy for Christians to actually be aware of the fact that we do live contra mundum, right, against the world. This world is not a world that loves Christ, and because of that, it does not love his truth, it does not love his beauty, it does not love his goodness. Accept that. And yet, it is the proclamation and the expression of that truth, beauty, and goodness that will devastate that darkness, that will set them free. And that's what we want to see happen in a very significant way. So yeah, I think that's the way that that I try to think of this and approach it. And of course, trusting that the Lord's doing something with all of it. So yeah.
I'm glad we jumped into this discussion, because this is kind of where I was hoping to go today, is just the broader discussion of in a negative world, which is where we live today, where there's two absolutely incongruent worldviews, incompatible worldviews that are at the forefronts of the culture. How do we go about communicating in a world like this? We're all about discipling nations here. You're about that as well. Your slogan is all of Christ for all of America. I like that slogan. We might steal that. And it's how do we convey that in a world where people, no matter what we say, some people will just hate us. Other people might listen to us, but maybe not for long, and they'll probably take everything that we say and skew it in the worst possible light, which is very easy to do. I know I do that sometimes, people I disagree with. So how do we communicate in this world? And what we can't do is we can't just keep staying in our camps, not talking to each other. That's not going to work. It's going to come to a head at some point. So just communication in a world like this is difficult. And like you just said in 1 Corinthians, the ways of the Spirit of God are foolishness to people who are unbelievers. So there's always that going against us in a way when we're trying to speak the truth. So yeah, and then within the church, there's this debate going on too between, I would kind of say, that the tone police people that want Christians just to be nice and winsome all the time. And then I would say some people that definitely go on the too much of the I'm a hostile culture warrior and I want to bash people who disagree with me. I think, yeah, I've seen that in some Christian circles as well. They get a little too fired up about the warrior side of things. So there's a middle ground, but I just want to learn. I just want to keep this discussion going. Any reflections to all of that? Do you guys agree with my assessment there?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. And I think this is why this is such an important and healthy discussion to have. Just, like how should we be approaching this? What does it look like to really engage culture? And yes, on one hand, there's the temptation to be too soft and nice and appeasing. And on the other side, there's the temptation of being hostile. And I don't want to say I don't want to necessarily synthesize those two and think that the synthesis of those two is the truth exactly. I think that there's a sense in which different contexts might actually require different approaches, right? Mm-hmm. I think sometimes you do need to be a little more combative. It's the picture of Boniface with his axe chopping down Thor's oak, and there's a place for that. But I think generally speaking, I think as Christians, our aim has got to be definitely confronting cultural idolatry, but also in actually building an alternative. And I think that's kind of where we've been lacking for the most part. We don't really know what it looks like to stand on an alternative that's actually tangible and potent. So where you see lies and you want to confront the lies, we ought to be seeking to propagate truth and beauty and goodness in very tangible ways, which in one way of doing that, as we spoke about earlier, is actually building Christian institutions. Like that is a tangible way that we develop an alternative for people, pursuing specific things. To kind of circle back to some of your initial question here, Luke, and line of thought, is I think one of the ways that we can also engage very effectively is by kind of touching where it hurts, right? So, for example, no one likes a bad economy, right? No one likes to have to experience high inflation. And that can actually be a very good conversation starter, even for hostile people. And you're just getting them to think about things like, where do you think a bad economy comes from? And you're kind of taking them to the logical conclusion of these things, where you can actually display Christianity as the best alternative to all the nonsense and the chaos that we see. We might have spoken on this on a different podcast, but it is kind of what's happened to someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, or Tom Holland to a degree, where as they see concerns in the culture, that prompts them to think and wonder, maybe there is something to this Christianity. Someone like Dawkins, who is perhaps one of the most famous atheists in the modern era, it's just fascinating to see him referring to himself as a cultural Christian, whatever that means. But I think it's just because as he compares notes in terms of what a non-Christian worldview has produced in comparison to a Christian worldview, there's a very stark difference there. And so I think that it would actually be strategic for us to kind of actually begin with where it hurts and seeking to bring about order in the places where there is visible chaos. And I think that's a strategic point that we could use to even start that kind of conversation. And more than just starting a conversation, going back to that idea of building alternatives, building institutions, building things, and beyond just building institutions as well, I think just being the kind of people that are a physical antithesis to the lies. So for example, in a world of lies, you want to tell the truth. In a world of escapism, fatalism, and despondency, you want to be the kind of person that lives with a sense of hope and joy. In a world where there's so much destruction, we should be seeking to want to bring aesthetic value to absolutely everything, in the way that we build and design our homes, in the way that we carry ourselves, in the way that we just go about our work, just doing it with a sense of excellence. All those things are actually potent tools in this cultural apologetic that we're seeking to establish. And so, engagement is more than just, in fact, I would say it is not a shouting match in that sense. It must involve so much more. So yes, on one hand, you're fighting evil, but on the other hand, you're building and establishing good.
Hmm.
Anyway, yeah, that was just me rambling there for a little bit.
No,
but
I really love that. I mean, in the rules of warfare today, in the culture war, it's the way it's being played out is so often I know exactly what I'm against, but I can't really tell you what I'm for. It's all about just bashing the other side. This is terrible ideas, and then being done. You're like, I did my job. I bashed them, and I hopped on X and I tore down their posts, and dunk on the liberals, right? And it's like, okay, but what are you actually for? What are you building? What's behind you? The only reason Richard Dawkins calls himself a cultural Christian is because he's observed the institutions that were built within a Christian nation and the beauty that came from that. The only reason Tom Holland is a Christian now is because he did a long history of he studied the history of the Christianity of the West, and he saw the institutions that Christians built and the goodness and beauty that those brought to the West. It's too bad that they have to look to the past to find those things and not exactly look to the present, which says volumes for how much we're building right now. But there's a lot to be said about living these things out, the institutions you're building, being paradoxical in that, right? Like a lot of people who, dislike me would probably stereotype me as someone who hates women's right to choose and wants to burn the planet or something like that. And I want to be a paradox to that, is I love my wife and I love my kids, and I love my wife's ability to choose and her ability to have freedom within God's boundaries. And I love my kids and I'm raising them well. And I love this beautiful planet that God's created because I know the artist. Like, that's paradoxical, and that doesn't really make sense to them. But my life should also reflect that, right? I should be building a life that reflects the truth of that. And when you do that, it's hard to argue with. When you see the way God's created us to live being lived out, it obviously is the best way to live because we live in God's world. And when people see that, it's hard to argue with that. That's that kind of building those institutions framed off of the lifestyle that God's given us to live in.
Luke, you've touched on something here that I think is actually so important, and I think is important to emphasize as well. Like when you mentioned how men like Holland and Dawkins have to look at the past in order to see something significant regarding Christianity, as opposed to looking at the modern world and seeing good examples of Christianity in this time period. And it makes me wonder just the state of Christianity as a whole, the state of the church. And one of the things, and we might have talked about this in previous conversations, but I firmly believe that the state of the culture is the resume of the church. There's a sense in which Christ's victory over sin and over death and his authority over absolutely everything means that he already owns everything, and he calls us as his people, as his redeemed people, to be his ambassadors and to be salt and light in this world in a very potent way. I mean, the way Paul describes this gospel that we proclaim is it's a gospel that has the power to transform. It's the power of God unto salvation. And you wonder, like, are we doing something with this gospel? Are we actually being the kind of light that we need to be? And it may be that we don't actually believe that our convictions are real, right? Like, I think there's a sense in which we think of them in abstraction, and we think of Christ like a king, but not really a king. We think of Christianity as like this kind of like true religion, but what kind of implications does that have for the real world? And I think that's actually where we struggle. I don't think we'd be able to necessarily put it in those words. But I think what I'm trying to hit at here is that we're the kinds of people who might ourselves in some way struggle with the truth of it all, with truth on its own. Like, is this truth actually real? Sure, we might be able to say that it holds up in a good debate, but is it actually real, is the question. And I think men tend to live by what they perceive to be real. If you really want to know what a people believe, well, look at how they live. They always live in light of what they perceive to be reality, whether that's actually falsehood or truth. And I think that as Christians, one of the ways that for sure that we know if we're really believing and abiding by the truth is, on one hand, the degree to which we are free and living as free people, and the degree to which we are living in and propagating human flourishing as a whole. I mention all this because we need to underscore the importance of checking our own convictions and actually assessing whether we believe our convictions to be truly real. And so it's important, I think, that as Christians, as the church, that we reckon with that in order for us to be able to build effectively.
Lennox, if I could come back to the interview for a second, because the kind of the narrative that was trying to be portrayed of the work in Moscow, Idaho there, and the various institutions and ministries, is very negative. The word theocracy appears in the title. And yet when I talk to some Christians, not just, to a typical audience member of CNN, but even other Christians, and I mentioned Doug Wilson or the work up in Moscow, some people they'll share some of those, those concerns, let's just say, and wonder, what exactly is happening up there. And I'd like to just take a second and have you kind of just respond to some of the concerns that I hear, and typically in the way that they're posed as well, if you don't mind. Maybe we can kind of go quickly through some of these concerns.
Yeah.
One of the concerns is you're trying to set up kind of a new Geneva, Calvin's Geneva, so to speak, taking over the town and the city of Moscow, Idaho. Are you trying to take it over? And if so, how?
Yeah, very simply, yes, we are trying to take it over.
Okay.
We're trying to take it over, not because we're trying to build a name or a kingdom for ourselves, but because Christ already owns this town, and we are his ambassadors that God has strategically and purposefully placed in this context, to build and to grow things and to exercise that cultural mandate to as best as we possibly can. And so in that sense, absolutely, like we're not going to apologize for who our Lord is and what he's doing in this world. Now the means
what does that look like practically, in terms of,
yes.
That's a kind of a triggering phrase, taking over the town.
It
is.
is.
What does that look like practically? What does that mean? What are you specifically doing? Maybe on things like city council, school board, I don't know, what just get into the nuts and bolts of that a little bit if you could.
Yeah, I think the one thing is just just the proclamation of the gospel, right? So like that evangelistic emphasis is important. I think when many people think of taking over the town in the way it's often posited, they're thinking that we're replacing the gospel with some sort of political tool to do so. No, not at all. We believe it is the word of God, the potency of the gospel that wins over people. It's powerful to transform individuals, and it's powerful to transform cultures. And that's the primary means through which we're doing this. And so we're not necessarily running the liberals out of town unless they just don't want to live alongside Christians. But we're actually seeking to love our neighbor, and we do so by proclaiming the truth to them, and seeking to serve them as best as we can. So that's where it begins. And then the other side of it is we encourage a culture of life and fertility. I think one of the tenets of the modern world is that it seems to essentially be a culture of death. Of course, like the number one cause of murder, in this world is abortion, right? It's the murder of children, of unborn children. And there's a sense in which we've normalized this. But I think beyond that, I think a culture of death is also one that doesn't encourage fruitfulness. It doesn't encourage things like ownership, for example, which is why communism and socialism are terrible ideas. And what we want to be doing as Christians is promoting this culture of life and fertility. And we do so by having good marriages, by wanting children, right. And seeking to raise them in the fear of the Lord. It's in just seeking to turn a profit in all those things that God has given us, and that's a tangible thing. So, for example, the Christians in Moscow, that's something that we take very seriously. We want to nurture that culture of life in our own spaces, and that actually it's amazing the kind of effect that has on the broader culture. That's an important aspect. And then the other aspect as well is just that building of Christian businesses. So we've got several Christian businesses in town, and you can feel it. You go in there and there's a tangible difference in the service. For example, there's this people-focused approach to the way that people establish businesses, and that's a real thing. And undergirding all those things really is just establishing our orientation towards God first and foremost. So I'd say that in that sense, probably the core institution of all of this really is the church, and people being gathered together in fellowship, worshiping the Lord Sunday after Sunday. It's interesting, like people think about that and they're like, oh, what does that have to do with taking over the town? It's like, well, absolutely everything, because politics flows downstream from culture, which flows downstream from religion, right? And so you actually can't divorce those two things. And it's only when we get our worship ordered rightly that we can really begin to influence culture and influence politics. And so that's what we're trying to get right. We want to get that religion right. We want to get our worship right. And we want that to spill over into the kind of cultures that we form in our own homes, the kind of cultures that we form in the institutions that we establish. And that then has, I think, an influence on how people think politically and what they practice politically. In Moscow, we still have our work cut out for us on the political front, but in our understanding of taking over the town, it starts with worship, and then we want the culture, and we then pray that that will spill over into actual real political influence as well, and other things too, not just politics, but the whole of life.
So yeah, because when I think of a local community like Moscow, which isn't much, it's about the same size as the town that Luke and I are living in here in Oregon Bend. I think of, when I think of the heart of the polis, if you will, the community, you think of things like public schools and the city council, city government that's making policies that affect the life of the community. You obviously think of the church too, right? But right now, the churches, because of their sacred secular divide and their thinking, often, they're not engaged, right, in a lot of the, or if they are, they kind of tend to keep their head down because it tends to be kind of a hostile culture. So you express your faith privately, and in church, but you don't really know how to do it publicly, but back to you guys in Moscow there, do you have people on city council, school boards, some of those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly think that that's the next thing. We don't. In fact, what people don't realize is that in Moscow, we have a city council that is very aggressive in opposing the Christians in town. You can essentially, in fact, people who they discover are part of our church community effectively get blacklisted. And that's a real problem. And so I think we certainly have our work cut out for us in that sense, and there's much to be done. I think that's the next phase that we probably need to be working on effectively. I think there's a sense in which, yes, we've got the worship right. Yes, we have certainly shaped and influenced the culture of Moscow. But as far as the political arena goes, we certainly still have our work cut out for us. So yeah.
Let me move on if I could, because I think this gets into kind of the tactics as well, and that includes language like taking over, and I know that triggers people, because it implies kind of almost warfare, Right. And again, there's definitely a place for warfare imagery in the scriptures, but this idea that we're gonna take it over for most people brings up kind of imagery of kind of a hostile takeover,
I just think of a Western, yeah,
right, we're gonna come out with the guns and take it over, and so and even some Christians have that idea. I was just talking to somebody recently, and they said that when it comes to the tactics, they're tactics of force and coercion. But I thought, I don't believe that. Could you speak to that? Because I think there is that idea that
who has tactics of force and coercion?
The Christian community up in Moscow, Idaho, that when they're talking about taking over, or they're talking about America being a Christian nation, the tactics employed in that would be wouldn't uphold freedom or liberty, religious liberty. It would really be more of kind of a force and coercion kind of an idea. To speak to that, that's I assume a false view, but I'd like you to address that if you could, Lennox. Yeah,
it is a false view, and that's because you can't force or coerce someone into really being a Christian in that sense.
Right.
There's a sense in which that's the work of the Holy Spirit. Our job is to propagate that truth that then the Holy Spirit seeks to apply and convert someone. And so that's certainly our fundamental approach to it. It's not force or coercion. In fact, something that we often like to say is that in the sort of Christian nation or Christian town that we're seeking to establish, there'd actually be more freedoms than they are currently. Right?
Just on that, if I could just there, because there's a lot of confusion on that, and I know I struggled, for quite a while. How do you affirm religious freedom, the freedom of the conscience, and yet kind of boldly proclaim Christ's supremacy over the nations? I think people struggle with that. How do those go together? Could you address that, Lennox?
Yeah. We could get into so many weeds here for sure. I think the first thing that I'll say to that for sure is that even this idea of religious liberty needs to be defined correctly. There's a sense in which for as long as people hold to false religions, they can't be free. And the irony of many of those other religions is that they're actually very intolerant of religions that oppose them. Christianity is actually the only religion that, while being true, is the only one that actually has a model for how to engage with religions that are opposed to it. For example, if you don't want more Islam, right? Because Islam will absolutely suffocate everything. There is no freedom of religion in that sense in Islam. There is no freedom of religion in many other nations and systems that are not Christian. And so what you have distinctly in Christian nations is a greater freedom to, one, worship the true and living God. And I think there's actually like this downstream effect that even those who don't necessarily bow the knee to Christ would have more freedom in a Christian republic, because Christians do not rule through force and coercion in that sense. They begin with this proclamation of the gospel. And so in that model...
If I could just underline that, I just think what you're saying is so important and so misunderstood that I think the first thing to say on that is Christianity alone uniquely undergirds or supports, first of all, the concept of freedom.
Right.
Okay. And specifically freedom of conscience, or what we would call religious liberty. Okay. And when I say that, just what you're saying, I'm just underscoring what you just said, Lennox. No other religion, no other worldview, Marxism, secularism, Islam, I don't care, you name it, they don't support the idea of freedom of conscience or freedom of religion.
Precisely.
So that needs to be understood, yes. To say we want to have a Christian nation is to say the same thing as we want to have a nation that upholds and respects religious liberty. And I know that those things, people struggle with that. Like, if you want a purely secular nation, that's kind of where we've moved to. And what you see is you see the erosion of freedom.
Absolutely.
The erosion of freedom of speech, you name it, even just religious liberty. We're going to make you, I always think about this in examples like Jack Phillips, the baker in Colorado. We're going to make you bake that cake. We're going to, they use these force and coercive tactics. Everyone does, except the church. And this, so again, when you say take over Moscow, you're not talking about taking it over by force.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not taking over by force. It's just the understanding that Christianity has the exclusive when it comes to freedom and when it comes to flourishing. And so out of love for our neighbors, sure, we want them to be Christian because we want them to experience true freedom and true flourishing. For as long as they persist in their false religions, they're never going to experience and enjoy that. And it would be actually unloving to not want them to be Christian, because then there's all kinds of bondage and destruction attached to that. And so in that sense, Christianity is actually good for the world. That's exactly what the world needs. And so I'm talking about establishing Christian towns and nations. This is a sense in which what we're trying to do is to get every knee to bow. But it's not just every knee in sort of this external sort of way. We're talking about a Christianity that appeals to people's thoughts and their affections and their wills, where they, because of the work of the gospel of Jesus Christ, are seeking to submit every single area of their lives to the lordship of Jesus Christ. Right? Like that's what we're seeking to do. And in this sense, it has, I think, in a sense, Christ's kingdom is not confined to our little hearts. Right, so it does go beyond that, and maybe that's kind of where people kind of struggle with, when you kind of have this vision for Christianity that applies in actual physical public spaces. And the truth is, because Christ is king over all spaces, we should be seeking to submit all these areas of life to him, helping people acknowledge his kingship in every single way. And so in taking over a town, I mean, it is, in this sense, using a term that the Bible gives us, it is this exercise of dominion. It is part, I think, of that great commission to go and disciple the nations.
If I could,
it's all-encompassing that way.
Yeah, if I could cut in right there, too, because the dominion of Christ, the kingship of Christ over this world is something that a lot of Christians don't believe. I mean, just this week, Larry Arnn, the president of Hillsdale College, he was on a podcast that got a lot of coverage, and he was the conversation. I think it was with who's the pastor there in
Kevin DeYoung.
Kevin DeYoung, yeah, and they were talking about Christian nations, and Larry Arnn said, well, America won't be a Christian nation because Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." I hear that all the time. It just came up in a conversation with a Christian friend the other day. When we were talking about influencing culture as Christians, they said, well, but Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." What's your response to that? That's a very common
I'm actually trying to pull up some scripture here, just so that we're fighting fire with fire here. That reference to "my kingdom not of this world" is a reference to John 18 specifically. Right. And this is Christ. I think he's before Pontius Pilate, and he makes this statement, "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise I would have had the Jews around me fighting for this kingdom." And that's not to say, to backtrack here, there's a big difference between Jesus saying, "My kingdom is not of this world," and him saying, "My kingdom is not in this world." What Christ is saying is that the source of my kingdom is different from the source of many earthly kingdoms. Earthly kingdoms seek to establish themselves by sword, right? But my kingdom transcends this, so it's absolutely everywhere. But it's not built from the same sort of substance. And just a few passages I want to read here, because I think it's just healthy to bring scripture to light on this. Of course, there's Matthew 28, verse 18, which says, "And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.'" Psalms 24, verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein." Isaiah 6, verse 3 says, "And one called to another and said, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.'" Daniel 7, verse 14 says, "And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." Anyway, there's like so many other passages we could point to that profoundly illustrate the kingship of Christ over absolutely everything. And it's interesting, and I might have mentioned this earlier in this conversation, but I think when people use those terms like King of Kings and Lord of Lords, they often think of this as a metaphor. Jesus is like a king, and he's like a lord. They don't actually think of it as a reality. Well, if he really is King of Kings, then wow, even the kings of the earth must bow to him. That means everything absolutely belongs to him. If he's Lord of Lords, if he really is sovereign as Scripture says, then that means that he really is ruling and reigning in a very real way. And I think that's something that we need to push, which is why it matters to apply his word to absolutely everything. I think the problem with truncating the domain of Christ, and some people like to think of it as only pertaining to salvation, right? There's only a soteriological focus to this. And we then tend to read the Bible only into the spaces that we think Christ rules over, which is why then we think the Bible only talks about salvation, but is holy and fit for everything else. But I think if we really understand the domain of Christ as being all-encompassing, then I think we'd understand that his word then has relevance, and I'd say authority over every single domain of life that influences the way we think about law, politics, economics, science, agriculture, you name it, absolutely everything.
No, absolutely correct.
Absolutely.
The idea that most evangelicals have, I think, is just what you're saying. Christ, when he says Christ is king, he's king over my heart, or he's king over the church, but that's where it ends. And beyond that, my kingdom is not of this world. And I always want to respond to people that say that okay, well, if Christ isn't king of this world, then who is? In other words, who has supreme authority? If it's not Christ, who does? Is it President Trump? Is it Xi Jinping? Is it who does? Right?
Yeah.
Is it Satan? Is it Satan? Who has supreme authority?
but you're right on the money, Scott.
Yeah.
In China, that's exactly how it's seen. Because they don't believe in God, they believe the state is God, and therefore their president becomes treated as a deity.
And we need to say very clearly as Christians, that's a lie. Yeah. You are not the king. Jesus is the king. I like the way that who was it? I think it was N.T. Wright. He said, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world, but my kingdom is for this world." I think it was something like that, and I love that. It's true. My kingdom is from heaven, but it's for this world. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's just, I want to just take a little time on that because it's such a confusion. I keep running into that. People love that phrase. Well, Jesus said, "My kingdom's not of this world." And then the subtext is, so don't engage in this world. Don't engage in politics and in community life and things like that, because that's some other realm that Christians shouldn't be that concerned about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I think something I've been thinking about in line of this discussion as well is when we're talking about who's the king of the world, a kingdom always has subjects, right? And if you ask a lot of Christians who are the subjects in this kingdom, if we're going to accept that God's kingdom is on earth, they would say Christians. And no, everyone.
Right.
We're all subjects of the king, every human ever. And for that reason, it's a lot easier to have a vision for discipling nations, because it's not that we're marching our army from the kingdom into the nations. It's that the nation's already God's. The people of that nation are already subjects of the king, and we're showing them that they are. We're letting them know that they're subjects of the king, essentially. We're shining light on that.
Yeah, like there's a sense in which we're not...
In the kingdom of God, where every knee will bow and every tongue confess. But at this present time, you don't see that. There's a passage in Hebrews that speaks to that. But at this present time, we don't see that. We see a lot of rebellion and people making themselves out to be kings themselves. The radical autonomy of the individual or the state or whatever it is. That's Christ's, how would you describe that? That's his tolerance, at least for a period of time, of this rebellion, but it's going to come to an end, so.
I mean, that's Romans 1, right? Verse 21, for although they knew God, they know God, they know the king. They've exchanged the truth of God for lies and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator.
God allows that. He allows that, He doesn't force people, so to speak. This is the basis of religious liberty. He doesn't force it. He tries to woo people in love and grace to bow the knee, at least for now. But there will be a day, when every knee will bow and every tongue confess, whether they want to or not.
Right.
So,
Psalm 2 tells us as much. The kings of the earth must kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and they perish on the way. He's a real king. He holds the kings of earth to account, and they must bow before him. Because he is king. And in that sense, even when we think about what discipling the nations means, we're not asking permission from people in a sense. We're actually making a proclamation. This is who Jesus is. He is Lord. But this is also what he's done for sinners. So trust him, obey him, live in humble obedience to him.
Right.
And I think we still live in this world where we think Christians are still asking for permission and apologizing for being Christians in some way, by not actually exercising dominion in the way that they ought to, by not discipling the nations as we're describing here. Our king is the one who's given us permission. He is the one that has commissioned us as his ambassadors to engage in this world. And I think we need to recover our confidence in that.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, Lennox, about our approach or tactics is kind of what we're talking about how Christians do this work of honoring Christ as King and really engaging in culture in a way that brings positive and tangible change. You said that there's a place for both kind of a wartime footing and a kind of a more aggressive challenge of the lies or whatever it is. I'm not quite sure how to describe that. And there's also a time to be building relationships and building trust and the context really determines a lot of that. And I think you see both of those in Jesus' ministry too. I think one of the things that we got to be careful of is kind of saying it's all this or it's all that, right? There's and I appreciated you said that earlier, that context is important, and using all the tools in the tool bag, right? Sometimes grace and love and trust and reaching out across the divide of hostility is and is really important, and other times it's important to stand. Kind of, you mentioned Boniface or whatever it is. There's times where we have to be, and so I thought that was a great observation.
Yeah, I think it's important. Like, not all contexts are going to be the same.
Right.
Some contexts need a different voice. For example, in more fatalistic cultures, I think it's very important to have a very optimistic tone in engaging them. In cultures that are just outrightly blasphemous, perhaps that's where you want to use more of that prophetic Isaiah type voice, where you're actually confronting and mocking their idolatry. But it's not all going to look the same in every single context, and that actually requires us to not be enslaved to myopia. Like, we actually have to be aware of who we're engaging with, as opposed to merely loving the sound of our own voices. I think we have to learn to understand how to communicate two different contexts effectively, and that requires kind of bursting our own bubbles sometimes, and trying to develop a language that's actually effective for communication.
That's good. The Bible puts emphasis on truth and love, grace and truth. Jesus is filled with grace and truth and love. And both of those, are so important. And the context in which you emphasize maybe one over the other is kind of what we're talking about. But they both need to be present, I think. And it's okay if some group or some people, kind of feel like, hey, we want to put the emphasis on truth, and others maybe on love. There's a place for both. I think we've got to be careful with that. Luke, we're probably needing to wrap up here. I want to create some space here for you. I'm sure you've got some thoughts or things you want to kind of wrap up with here with Lennox.
Well, I mean, I'd be remiss to wrap up a conversation with Lennox without bringing up Lord of the Rings. So as you guys are talking right now about truth and love, I'm just thinking of Gandalf. He on one hand is the fatherly, grandfather-like figure to the hobbits. He looks out for them in the beginning, and he comes and shoots off fireworks at their birthday parties. But then on the other side, he's storming the gates of Mordor. That's just what I was picturing. Yeah.
And I think even the picture of like these little creatures who don't have a natural disposition in combat, but Gandalf recognizing that they actually need to assume responsibility for their well-being of their own places by actually getting out the door. Like, you actually do need to go on this adventure. You do need to go have experiences with dragons and orcs and all
you need to pick up a sword.
Exactly. So there's also, and I think that's actually a very apt example you've given there, Luke. Gandalf kind of pushing people towards both. Enjoy your garden and your fellowship and your merrymaking, but also recognize that oftentimes, in order to enable that and preserve that, one does need to go and do some dangerous things that are risky, but they are good. And it's important.
It always comes up.
No, it has to.
Okay, Doug, over to you.
Well, that's it. Yeah, Lennox, any final thoughts from you as we wrap up today? I really appreciate the conversation and just the clarification and just the deeper insight into you and the ministry there in Moscow with the New St. Andrews and the group. I really do respect and count what you guys are doing up there as important as allies, as making a difference as well. So even though it may not be everyone's cup of tea, I think what you're doing is really important, showing some important things, some important ways of being Christians in this time in the country, given the crises we're facing. So final thoughts from you?
I think just a final thought that I think is important in all of it as well is, when people do hear some of the words that we employ towards trying to establish distinctly Christian contexts, we ought to be intentional about the words that we employ. And so in our use of the word like theocracy, for example, there's a sense in which we ought not to let the non-believers assume ownership of these terms and seek to redefine them. I think there's probably no one who understands what I'm saying better than you, Scott. I think that your book on 10 words is actually one of the best books out there that really proposes just a very similar idea, and recognizing that there is a war for the dictionary taking place even within culture. And we need to be willing to, I think, one, just redeem words, but also be very intentional in the kinds of words that we're using in our cultural engagement. And that, I think that's a very important component of it. So even a word like dominion, people are going to try to demonize it. And yet that's a word that God actually gives us. And so we ought to employ that as Christians. But
well said.
yeah,
And,
I think
the whole discussion of words and definitions of words, it gets right back to what we were talking about earlier. If Jesus is truly king, not just of heaven, but of earth, then he has the right as the king to define words, right? If he's not, then we can define words and we can change those definitions, right? And definitions really don't matter that much because they're constantly in flux and fluid. But if he's the king and if he spoke, which he did, and he recorded his revelation in words in the scripture, and he defined words like justice and truth and whatnot, then we have to respect his kingship authority here on earth in terms of those definitions. And so I have challenged Christians, if Jesus is just king of heaven, he's not king of the earth, well, do you treat his word that way, or does his word have binding authority, even here on earth, not just even in the church, but in a culture? Like, can the culture have a different definition of justice than the church? Is that okay? So it puts that whole discussion in a really, I think, very helpful light, actually. So
good. I think you might need to write a follow-up to this, Scott. But it's become my very firm conviction that, one of the tools of our warfare in cultural engagement, and as we're seeking to build distinctly Christian cultures, is the necessity of developing actual Christian lexicons, actual dictionaries, to promote literacy in a holistic and robust way. So I think you're the man to write it.
No, that was, honestly, I'm just excited about the idea. It was great men like Noah Webster, that really had that conviction.
Exactly.
We need new Noah Websters. I'm not sure I'm the one, but we need them. So anyways, well, listen, Lennox, thank you so much for this really rich discussion. It's just a joy, and appreciate the depth of insight. So keep up the good work. Give our greetings to your friends and coworkers there up there in Idaho in the ministry, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon. So,
anytime. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thanks again for tuning in to another episode here on Ideas Have Consequences. If you'd like to learn more about our good friend Lennox Kalifungwa and the amazing work that he is doing over in Moscow, make sure to look in the episode show notes, as we've included more information about him, his writing, his work at New St. Andrews, and his 2 podcasts, which are titled Of Flames and Crowns and Of Kings and Statesmen. I would recommend both of those podcasts myself. If you'd like to listen to a great episode on his podcast Of Flames and Crowns, I would recommend the episode he actually did earlier this year with my dad, where my dad talked about his newest book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meanings of Our Most Important Words. I've also included a link to that episode down in the show notes as well. So with that, thanks again for listening. We truly appreciate your guys' time and attention as you listen in each week to these episodes. It's truly humbling and encouraging to see how many of you guys are tuning in to the podcast. So we just wanted to appreciate you guys for listening in today. And with that, we hope you'll be able to tune in again next week here on Ideas Have Consequences.